while Washington's political elites continue to preach doctrines of global dominance. The very servicemen and women tasked with projecting that overwhelming power are quietly setting their own multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers on fire just to avoid deployment. This isn't merely a localized tale of disgruntled sailors or isolated maintenance failures. Rather, this is the chilling, undeniable symptom of an overextended empire physically and psychologically cannibalizing itself from within. Think about the gravity of this. The ultimate guarantor of the old world order is rotting from the inside out. This systemic paralysis directly impacts the shifting global security architecture, the safety of international supply chains, and ultimately the economic realities you face every single day. When the armed enforcers of Western hegemony actively scheme to avoid the battlefield, the ensuing geopolitical vacuum will ruthlessly devour the unprepared. I am Alexander Grant, and welcome back to Grant Geopolitics. Today we are stripping away the Pentagon's polished press briefings to expose the calculated silent mutiny that is actively paralyzing the American military machine. Indeed, to see this mutiny in action, consider the peculiar case of the U.S. Dwight D. Eisenhower. After returning to port for scheduled maintenance in July of 2024, the timeline dictated a completion by mid-2025, positioning the nuclear-powered behemoth for another high-stakes deployment in the latter half of the year. But then an incredibly convenient anomaly occurred. A fire broke out on board. Why would such an incident happen at the exact moment a vessel is being prepped to return to the front lines? For the young sailors and technicians facing the grim prospect of navigating actively hostile geopolitical choke points, a sudden catastrophe offers a profound, unspoken sense of relief. The vessel is immobilized, the deployment is indefinitely paused, and the crew remains safely ashore. It is a quiet, desperate victory for those who refuse to be pawns in a great power struggle. Furthermore, this is not an isolated spark. It is a calculated stall tactic built upon a surprisingly mature precedent of naval self-sabotage. The Eisenhower is already approaching the twilight of its operational life. Designed for a 50-year service window, its expiration date looms around 2027, perhaps stretched by bureaucratic desperation to 2029. When you factor in the notoriously glacial pace of American naval shipyards, a repair job that should take months can effortlessly stretch into 3 to 5 years. If the maintenance is delayed long enough, the vessel simply ages out of the fleet entirely and transitions straight into the scrapyard. The immediate result is that the crew is permanently insulated from the battlefield. Is it any wonder that these convenient accidents happen repeatedly? To truly grasp the magnitude of this localized subversion, we must zoom out and examine the crippling macro data defining the United States Navy today. On paper, Washington boasts a formidable fleet of roughly 290 warships, yet the reality of what can actually be deployed to project power is startlingly different. Nearly 40% of the American fast attack submarine fleet is currently paralyzed in maintenance backlogs, trapped in dry docks rather than patrolling the oceans. Public shipyards are short tens of thousands of skilled workers, and the infrastructure required to sustain a global armada is decaying rapidly. When a crew intentionally incapacitates their own ship, taking a cue from previous highly suspicious shipyard fires, they are not merely breaking a machine. They are brilliantly weaponizing the Pentagon's own logistical paralysis against it. They know perfectly well that the industrial base lacks the capacity to quickly repair the damage. This dynamic exposes a fatal blind spot in the architecture of Western maritime dominance. The theoretical projection of power fundamentally relies on the assumption that the operators of these multi-billion-dollar platforms actually possess the will to operate them in harm's way. However, when the survival instinct of the individual sailor overrides the strategic mandates of political elites, the entire enforcement mechanism collapses inward. The financial burden of maintaining these floating fortresses is astronomical, yet that investment is instantly nullified by a few carefully misplaced sparks. External geopolitical competitors, observing this phenomenon from afar, are surely taking notes. They realize they may not even need to deploy hyper-advanced anti-ship ballistic missiles to neutralize a carrier strike group, provided the carrier's own crew ensures the vessel never leaves the pier. Like a colossal ironclad leviathan slowly suffocating in its own shallow harbor, the American naval apparatus is being hollowed out not by the kinetic strikes of its adversaries, but by the quiet, calculated apathy of its own caretakers. The ultimate collapse of global maritime hegemony is not announced by the thunder of enemy cannons, but by the silent, intentional breaking of internal gears. Yet, while the spectacular flames aboard a stationary aircraft carrier might serve as the most visible form of evasion, the tactical retreat of the average American sailor has evolved into something far more subtle and deeply systemic. When a warship is actively deployed, lingering in contested waters and relying entirely on underway replenishment vessels to avoid pulling into port, the dynamic drastically shifts. Setting a major fire in the middle of a vast ocean is a perilous gamble. It threatens the immediate survival of the crew. Thus, the modern evasion of duty does not look like a chaotic, cinematic uprising. Instead, it manifests as a quiet surgical dismantling of the vessel's internal circulatory system. The focus deliberately shifts away from the highly monitored, hyper-expensive weapon systems and turns toward the mundane, labyrinthine network of propulsion and plumbing. Why leave the weapon systems intact? The underlying logic is as coldly rational as it is brilliant. Sabotaging an Aegis combat system or tampering with a vertical launch tube requires specialized technical clearances, invites immediate and severe criminal investigation, and most crucially, leaves the crew completely defenseless in a hostile theater. But what happens when the sabotage is directed at the ship's obscure, sprawling pipework? A modern combat vessel contains miles of intricately woven pipes stretching from the deepest engine rooms to the upper decks. By subtly introducing water into the fuel lines, or conversely, allowing oil to seep into the freshwater systems, a sailor achieves maximum operational disruption with virtually zero traceability. It is an untraceable anomaly, easily dismissed as a routine structural failure or a maintenance oversight on a heavily strained hull. The intended result is an immediate, localized failure of the propulsion plant. The multi-billion-dollar warship effectively becomes a multi-billion-dollar piece of floating debris. Yet, this is precisely the desired outcome for those desperate to avoid a conflict. Losing propulsion does not mean the ship is sinking. It simply means it is drifting. The air defense radars continue to spin. The surface-to-air missiles remain armed and ready, and the crew remains perfectly safe from external aerial or missile threats. However, because the vessel is rendered entirely mission incapable, it can no longer project power, enforce maritime blockades, or engage in offensive maneuvers. The crew merely has to wait in relative safety until a fleet tug or an Allied rescue ship arrives to tow them thousands of miles away from the flashpoint. Straight back to the comforting shores of a home port, this localized strategy of subversion extends seamlessly to the aviation divisions. A modern supercarrier is functionally useless without its integrated air wing. By deliberately contaminating the specialized aviation fuel reserves, an act that is notoriously difficult to pin on a single individual, the entire fleet of multi-million-dollar combat jets is instantly grounded. The pilots cannot fly, the flight deck ceases operations, and the core offensive capability of the carrier strike group is neutralized without a single shot being fired by an external geopolitical competitor. The personnel successfully orchestrate their own withdrawal. This phenomenon represents a fascinating evolution in asymmetric warfare, waged not by rival nations, but by a military apparatus secretly fighting against its own operational mandates. The United States continues to allocate astronomical budgets toward developing the most sophisticated kinetic interceptors and stealth platforms the world has ever seen, largely ignoring the fragile human element operating the critical valves in the lower decks. Like a heavily armored apex predator whose own immune system is systematically dismantling its cardiovascular network, the surface fleet appears terrifying on radar, yet is entirely paralyzed from within. The ultimate vulnerability of a global empire does not lie in the trajectory of a hypersonic missile, but in the quiet, deliberate turn of a wrench in the darkest corner of an engine room. Consequently, have you ever considered the sheer logistical miracle required to keep a fifth-generation stealth fighter in the air? The maintenance protocols for these hyper-advanced platforms are already an engineering nightmare. Traditionally, when supply chains falter and crucial replacement parts are delayed, aviation maintainers engage in a desperate practice known as cannibalization, stripping fully functional components from a damaged or grounded aircraft to keep another one flying. But what happens when the operational goal of the personnel on the flight line quietly shifts from combat readiness to conflict avoidance? The process is simply reversed. In a masterful display of silent resistance, ground crews and technicians can execute a strategy of reverse cannibalization. Instead of pulling good parts from a broken jet to fix a good one, they systematically install faulty, degraded, or failing components onto otherwise healthy airframes. The beauty of this tactic lies in its plausible deniability. A stealth fighter, like the F-35, is a labyrinth of millions of lines of code, delicate radar-absorbent coatings, and hypersensitive avionics. When a diagnostic computer flags a catastrophic system error, command cannot possibly verify whether the malfunction is the result of genuine wear and tear, or a deliberate, quiet reassembly by a reluctant mechanic. The immediate consequence is absolute. The aircraft is officially grounded. The sorties cannot be authorized. The mission simply evaporates into the administrative ether. Everyone remains safe on the ground. To understand the devastating impact of this intentional degradation, one must look at the hard statistical reality of American air power. The public is constantly fed a narrative of unassailable Western air superiority built upon massive fleets of advanced combat aircraft. Yet, the actual mission-capable rates for these multi-million-dollar platforms have consistently languished, often struggling to break the 55% threshold even under optimal peacetime conditions. When you inject deliberate, systemic sabotage into an already fragile maintenance ecosystem, that readiness rate plummets dramatically. If headquarters demands to know how many fighters are fully armed and ready to intercept an incoming threat or project power across a contested strait, the maintainers can simply point to the grounded fleet and shrug. The numbers do not lie, even if the reasons behind them are completely manufactured. This tactical evasion completely shatters the grand illusion of the invincible American air armada. External geopolitical competitors are meticulously tracking these exact readiness metrics. They understand that a hangar full of cutting-edge stealth fighters is strategically meaningless if the mechanical workforce actively ensures those jets never leave the tarmac. It forces a fundamental recalculation of global threat levels. Why invest billions in anti-access and area denial defense networks if the adversary's own airmen are voluntarily neutralizing their strike capabilities from within? The technological edge is completely neutralized by the human element's refusal to participate. Like a majestic falcon whose own feathers are being quietly plucked away by the very caretakers meant to prepare it for the hunt, the aerial armada is grounded not by the gravity of enemy fire, but by the heavy, unspoken refusal of its own crews. The true vulnerability of a modern air force is hidden beneath the canopy, resting in the hands of the individuals who realize that a broken machine is the ultimate shield against a looming war. Furthermore, for the ground forces, the stark reality of modern warfare presents a unique dilemma. Unlike the naval fleets or the aviation squadrons, the infantry does not possess a colossal, centralized mechanical platform to conveniently sabotage. When the command is handed down to mobilize into a contested theater, the individual soldier cannot simply short-circuit a propulsion plant or contaminate a fuel reservoir to halt the advance. They are the platform. They are the primary kinetic asset, expected to step directly into the geopolitical friction zone. Therefore, to execute a successful evasion of duty, the individual must render themselves structurally and legally incapable of entering the battlefield. If the machinery cannot be broken, the human element must become the point of failure, shifting the strategy from physical sabotage to the absolute weaponization of bureaucracy. This phenomenon manifests in a sudden, remarkable surge of administrative and medical maneuvering. A service member might abruptly declare a profound, newly discovered spiritual or ideological awakening, filing extensive paperwork to be classified as a conscientious objector, citing a strict moral absolute against the taking of life or the bearing of arms. Others turn to the vast, complex labyrinth of the military medical apparatus. A vague but persistent neurological complaint, an untraceable chronic pain, or a debilitating psychological barrier quickly becomes the ultimate shield. As long as a military physician signs the profile, the service member is officially classified as medically undeployable. They are legally insulated from the front lines, trapped safely behind an impenetrable fortress of medical waivers and administrative red tape. To fully comprehend the scale of this paralyzing inertia, one must examine the broader demographic and sociological collapse currently hollowing out the American ground forces. The United States military is enduring its most severe recruitment deficit since the creation of the all-volunteer force in 1973, frequently missing annual recruiting targets by tens of thousands of active duty personnel. Yet, the deeper, more dangerous crisis lies within the ranks already serving. A deeply polarized domestic society has inevitably birthed a military structure increasingly stripped of its foundational martial spirit. The historical aggressive drive to project force and secure Western dominance has been steadily replaced by a desperate overriding instinct for individual self-preservation. When the overarching ideological justification for overseas intervention evaporates in the minds of the troops, the soldiers expected to execute Washington's orders will inevitably find any legal loophole necessary to avoid the sacrifice. Even when cornered and forced into an active deployment, the tactical stalling persists. An infantry unit tasked with a high-risk advance will instinctively call for immediate close air support, effectively attempting to shift the burden of kinetic engagement back to the aviation wings. But, as we have already established, those very aviators are simultaneously orchestrating their own localized retreats by quietly grounding their squadrons. The result is a profound, systemic operational gridlock. The ground troops seek cover, waiting for an aerial intervention that will never materialize, intentionally dragging out the operational timeline. Every hour spent waiting in the rear, every day stalled by an engineered lack of support, is another day closer to the expiration of their enlistment contract and a guaranteed flight back home. Like a heavily armored knight whose own muscles absolutely refuse to respond to the commands of an exhausted mind, the ground forces are trapped in a state of deliberate bureaucratic paralysis. The ultimate failure of a ground campaign is not sealed by the overwhelming maneuvers of a superior geopolitical rival, but by the quiet administrative mutiny of a weary legion that simply refuses to march. Ultimately, this pervasive culture of evasion across the naval, aerial, and ground domains coalesces into a singular, undeniable strategic posture, the grand paralysis of waiting. When an entire military apparatus covertly prioritizes conflict avoidance over power projection, the operational tempo grinds to an agonizing halt. The overarching objective for the individual service member is no longer to achieve tactical victory or secure a contested objective, but simply to stall. They are merely running out the clock. Whether it is an incapacitated destroyer, drifting helplessly in open waters, awaiting a fleet tug, a squadron of grounded fighters perpetually waiting for replacement parts, or an infantry battalion entrenched in administrative limbo, waiting for an aerial support element that has intentionally sidelined itself. The defining characteristic of the force becomes an orchestrated, systemic inertia. This intentional stagnation has profound, immediate consequences on the global geopolitical chessboard. The United States currently maintains a sprawling network of over 750 known military installations spread across more than 80 countries. The maintenance and operational logistics required to sustain this massive global footprint demand a hyper-efficient, highly motivated force. However, when the operators within that force systematically engineer delays, the entire timeline of Western military intervention collapses. A deployment that is delayed by 6 months due to a mysterious shipyard fire or a sudden spike in undeployable personnel is often a deployment that misses the critical window of geopolitical opportunity altogether. By the time the bureaucratic and mechanical friction is finally resolved, the strategic landscape has already shifted, and the initial objective is lost. External geopolitical competitors do not even need to engage in direct kinetic conflict to secure their territorial or economic ambitions. They simply watch as the adversary's intervention force quietly runs its own clock into expiration. The strategic implications are catastrophic for the architects of the old world order. The ultimate deterrent against shifting global power dynamics has always been the credible threat of rapid, overwhelming military intervention. Yet how credible is that threat when the very enforcers of that power are actively sabotaging their own transport and weapons platforms. It transforms the most heavily funded military organization in human history into an incredibly expensive, heavily armored paper tiger. The billions of dollars poured into next-generation defense budgets are effectively neutralized by the sheer, unyielding apathy of the human elements required to execute the mission. Like a magnificent towering oak tree whose root system has silently turned to ash, the outward appearance of strength remains formidable, yet the entire structure is destined to collapse under its own weight at the first sign of a genuine storm. In the end, the most devastating weapon deployed against the modern empire is not forged in the arsenals of its rivals, but born from the quiet, desperate instinct of its own soldiers simply wanting to go home. In conclusion, history provides a ruthless, undeniable lesson for those willing to observe. Sprawling global systems rarely fall solely due to the overwhelming force of outside conquest. More often than not, they crumble quietly from within, when the legions tasked with defending the perimeter no longer believe in the march. As we watch these massive geopolitical tectonic plates shift in real time, it is crucial to recognize that technological supremacy and astronomical defense budgets can never truly compensate for a shattered will to fight. The most advanced weaponry on the planet remains completely dormant if the individuals meant to wield it actively refuse to engage. What are your thoughts on this silent internal paralysis? Can the sheer volume of military hardware sustain an international posture when the human foundation is systematically retreating? Please share your perspective in the comments section below. I genuinely look forward to reading your insight. If this analysis brought you a clearer understanding of the hidden dynamics shaping our world, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay observant, and thank you for joining me here at Grant Geopolitics.